My name again is Philip Johnston. I'm the branch director of CAFE Vancouver. CAFE, or the Canadian Association for Equality, is a registered educational charity that focuses on gender equality, but particularly the inequities that men and boys face in society. Some examples of those inequities are the lack of resources for male victims of intimate partner violence, the underachievement of boys in education, and the high rates of suicide that we'll be discussing today. CAFE's advocacy work consists of advertising campaigns and sponsoring events on university campuses like this one today. But our chapter wants to also start focusing on creating resources to fill the gaps that exist right now for male victims of domestic violence, as I mentioned, men and boys struggling with mental health issues, to name a couple of gaps that we would like to help fill. CAFE Toronto opened the first successful center for men and families in 2015. We'd like the second to be here in Vancouver, but to do that, we need your help. There's a donation jar that'll be on the table outside, and on your event survey, there is a box you can tick if you'd like to donate online. Please consider donating. All the work that goes into these events is done by volunteers, so that all the people with tags here are helping. They're volunteers involved. So because of the hard work of these volunteers, the advocacy movement for men and boys is gaining serious momentum here in Vancouver. Help us maintain that momentum by giving generously so we can continue to host events such as this and create the resources this community has been searching for. Thank you.
We will now have our feature presentation by Dr. Robert Whitley. He is our feature presenter today. He's the Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at McGill University and the Douglas Mental Health University Institute. He has published over 100 papers in the area of social and cultural psychiatry and currently leads projects funded by the Mental Health Commission of Canada and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Robert Whitley.
Well, first off, thank you everybody for coming. I'm thrilled to be here, and I would like to especially thank Jesse and Enya and Phil for the invitation. I'm incredibly impressed at the work that the SFU AMB have been doing. I've been watching all your videos on YouTube and kind of jealous actually. I think you've got great videography, great interview skills, and it's amazing for a group of young people who are so committed. And thanks to Phil as well and CAFE Vancouver for hosting the event. And thank you all for coming. And this is being live streamed on YouTube. And for those people who are watching, I don't think they're aware that it's a beautiful day here in Vancouver. There's not a cloud in the sky. It hasn't rained, which I understand is not very common here in the city for 2 days, or at least since I've been here on Friday. So it's really great to see a great crowd here, and thank you. It's sunny outside, but sadly this topic is not a sunny topic. We're talking about suicide, and in particular suicide in men. And what I've done is I've put some pictures around the wall. You can see some of them. And these are just pictures. I went on my computer when I was in Montreal on Friday and just put in recent male suicides. And these are pictures of people, unfortunately, who have recently killed themselves from various different provinces. And for those of you who are close and can see them, they're young people, they're older people, they're people from every race and ethnicity. They're people from all over Canada, different provinces. And it really is a human issue that we're talking about today. It's not only a health problem, it's not only a social problem, it's a human problem. And I really hope that we can begin to address this. So how I'm going to format the presentation today is, in the beginning I'm actually going to talk about facts. These are kind of incontrovertible facts. I'm then going to talk about some of the causes of the high rates of suicide, and I'm going to proceed from the causes which have a lot of evidence to the potential causes which do not have a lot of evidence, but that's not necessarily because they're not supported by evidence, it's because the studies have not been done and because we haven't collected the data. And that's one thing we know about social science and social psychiatry. If you don't collect the data, then in a way the problem doesn't exist in society's eyes. And if you do collect the data and if you can get funding to do studies, then you can shed light on these things. And then I'm going to end on talking about potential solutions. So the facts, the kind of theories and causes, and then the solutions. We'll have a question and answer session afterwards. I'd rather kind of rename that a discussion rather than a question and answer. I don't know everybody in the room, but I imagine everybody in here has their own skills and their own thoughts, their own ideas. So shouldn't just be me sitting here fielding questions, but more of a general discussion. So first off, as I said, I wanted to start with some general facts. There are approximately 4,000 suicides per year in Canada. And of these, 75% are made by men. So that is approximately 3,000 suicides by men in Canada. If you do the mathematics, you will work out that that approximates to about 50 or 60 per week. And then if you do any further mathematics, you'll work out that that approximates to about 1 every 3 hours. So I came into this lecture hall at 3 p.m. and I think I'll be here till approximately 6 p.m. Probably in that space of time, one man in Canada would have taken his life. And actually, because it's a Sunday, there's actually higher rates at the weekend, so maybe even more. Now, there is some evidence that this is an underestimation of the real rates of suicide. So we know that people, for example, who die by an overdose, people who die in motor traffic accidents, people who die in some of these kind of ambiguous ways, they are actually intending to kill themselves, but they're entered into the records as death by accident, death by misadventure, death by overdose, etc. So this is considered to be an underestimation of the real problem. And this is also because of, this is a wider issue. Why are they classified in this way? Sometimes there's pressure from families and there's pressure from other people because of the stigma of suicide. Also because of issues like life insurance. Some life insurance policies will not pay if somebody dies by suicide. So if your husband or your son or father dies by suicide, you would rather it was classified officially as something else. Statistically, it's quite interesting. So what's happened in the last few decades, suicide was traditionally considered a young person's problem, and it affects all men. But if you look back in the 80s and 90s, it was slightly more common amongst younger people. What's happened recently is that the highest rates are in the age group from 40 to 55. So it's actually middle-aged men who have the highest rates of suicide. And there's what we call in social science a bimodal distribution. So that's a fancy word for meaning that there's two peaks. So there's a peak in middle-aged, and it goes down again. And then there's another peak in the late 70s, early 80s. So the two most at-risk groups are middle-aged men and later in life. Now there's suicides in every age group, and it's, as I said, it's more just a kind of a peak, a wave, if you can imagine. But they're the big at-risk group. And as I'll talk about when we get to the causes, some people find this paradoxical because they say, well, middle-aged men are the most powerful men in Canada. They have jobs, they have privilege, male privilege, etc. But as we'll see when I get to the causes, that's not necessarily the case. That's a massive assumption. One thing I should say about Canada is this is actually different to some of the European countries. So in European countries, suicide in young people is still the biggest peak. So when we see this kind of bimodal distribution in Canada, it does imply that there's something about the social environment here in Canada which is affecting men of this age more than those in European countries. As many of you probably know, certain groups have elevated rates of suicide. And I'm not really going to go into too much detail there because that's a completely separate subject and we only have 60 minutes. But I'm sure you all know that the group that has the highest rates are Aboriginal people, especially those who live up north. And this is due to various processes of alienation, of lack of purpose, meaning, poverty. It's a subject for another lecture, so I'm not really going to go down that route, but I would like to, as you acknowledged in the beginning, that this is unceded land, to acknowledge that this is a huge social problem, again, not receiving the attention it deserves and brushed under the carpet. and I hope that this is something that gets addressed as time progresses. I'd also like to introduce you to a concept which I don't know how many of you have heard of this. How many people have heard of the concept of slow motion suicide? So probably about a quarter of the people. So there's a concept we use in social science called slow motion suicide, or there's other words for it. This basically means people who drink, who have addictions problems. They drink a lot, they take a lot of drugs, they don't eat well, they don't sleep well, they don't lead a healthy lifestyle, and probably we all know people like this, and they end up dying well before their time, in their 30s or 40s or even their 20s. If you think of these celebrities, people like Amy Winehouse, for example, who just led a life of unhealthy choices, one could say, or unhealthy habits, and then they die. And if you, which I'm not going to do for the purposes of this presentation, but if you add in the statistics of people who die from slow motion suicide, that makes it an even bigger social problem. And some people have argued that the causes, addictions, as I'll get to later, are one of the predictors of suicidal behaviour. And if you add in addictions and slow motion suicide, there's a huge relation, and that's another problem. So what I wanted to do today was to talk about the causes. This is going to move on from the facts to some of the causes. And as I said, I'm going to start with the causes which have a lot of empirical evidence, and then move on to more potential causes, or ones that have been underexplored. I think you'll find when you read about suicide and the whole area of men's health, a lot of simplistic platitudes about suicide and men's health and men's addictions. Some of these platitudes are that men are stubborn, men are self-defeating, men don't talk about their feelings. And I'm going to talk about this somewhat later, but one of my aims today is to actually give information that there's some truth in some of those statements, but that's one tiny part of the jigsaw. That there's a much wider jigsaw out there, and bigger pieces that nobody is really talking about. And I'm going to talk about some of these issues. So I'm going to move away from these kind of simplistic platitudes. So if you came to hear me talk about stubbornness and men being self-defeating and men have just got to be more like women, that's not what I'm going to be saying. So I thematized my presentation into kind of 6 potential causes, or 6 causes with varying levels of evidence. And the first one I wanted to talk about, which has a huge amount of empirical support, is what we call childhood experience, or early childhood experience. So we know that boys and girls, but boys it's a higher risk, who have been physically or sexually abused as a child have a very high risk of suicide. This is one of the explanations for the high risk in Aboriginal populations. Those who went to residential schools were brutalised, one could say, by the teachers, and were separated from their parents and treated in an inhumane manner. We know that children who are separated from their father, boys who are separated from their father, are twice as likely to kill themselves than girls, and then people who aren't separated from their father. And there's a lot of literature on this and a lot of theory behind why this is the case. And you're probably thinking it's quite easy to put 2 and 2 together in this case. It is true. Boys need male role models. They need to have a father around who can give them advice and can help them learn to be a man as they grow up. And there's been literature, which I'm going to get to later, that there's a systematic problem, and Canada might be a particular example of this, in boys being separated from their fathers. And people have pointed the fingers at family courts and what Don said, not the justice system, the legal system. The legal system being biased against fathers, and that kind of systematically colluding the state and the mother colluding against the father of children, the father of the boys. So the boys get to spend limited time with their fathers, and this has a negative impact on many domains. So it leads to higher rates of ADHD, high rates of high school dropouts, high rates of suicide, boys who are raised without a father more likely to end up in prison, to be violent criminals. So this is a huge issue and is not being addressed. There have been numerous studies which have examined boys who have had problems in school, delinquency, an old-fashioned word that we use, boys who have been suspended, problems they've had there, and they also have high rates of suicide. There's controversial literature on childhood mental disorder. So decades ago there was a belief that children didn't really get mental illnesses, that they were kind of lonely, or they were unruly, or they were spirited. These were the kind of words that were used, or were disruptive. Now we have these diagnoses called conduct disorder. You may have heard of some of these: attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Bipolar disorder now is even considered a childhood disorder, and there are children as young as 5 or 6 who are on medication for many of these so-called illnesses, I should say. Christina Hoff Sommers wrote a great book called The War on Boys, where she talks about how boys are being over-medicated, how boys who in the past would have been considered spirited or perhaps unruly at worst are now considered to be ill and to be given a whole cocktail of medication where we don't know the long-term side effects, we don't know how they're affecting other aspects of the biology of the boy's body. And a lot of the research shows that those boys who have these childhood mental disorders end up having a higher risk of suicide than those who don't. So these are some kind of facts, and when we talk about solutions later, what I'm going to say is that there's this literature which says there's a crisis of boys in Canada and the US and North America, I think has a lot of weight behind it. And nobody's really, at higher levels, nobody's really acknowledging this or taking any action, which is not the same in other countries. In Australia, for example, there are government units who are acknowledging there's a crisis in boys dropping out of school, boys being disruptive, etc. But this is one of the great predictors, and any suicide prevention strategy, I think, has to get to the root of the problem and begin by looking at these issues of childhood experience. That's the first cause that I'd like to talk about, and as I said, that has a lot of weight and a lot of evidence behind it. There's a second cause which I've kind of labelled employment, work, economic issues. And again, this has been well studied and well researched. You can look at the individual, or you can look at the wider social environment, and I'll do both in this section of the presentation. What we do know in terms of the wider social environment is that there's been a massive socio-economic change in the last few decades. So we've moved from a period where men used to reasonably expect a job for life, a wife for life, a nuclear family, to be able to buy their own home, which I understand in Vancouver is a massive issue. Real estate prices seem astronomical here. I mean, so I'm sure you don't want me to get started on that. And when you think of men of a previous generation as well, there were things such as trade unions, fraternal organisations, parent-teacher associations, ELKs, Lions clubs, men who would volunteer in local youth clubs, would volunteer in hockey, etc., sports clubs. Sociological research shows that there's been a massive decline in almost everything I just said in the last few decades. Decline in jobs for life, a decline in marriage, rates of marriage, and then an increase in divorce rates. So 40% of marriages in Canada now end in divorce. There's now much more people living alone than previously. A decline in membership of trade unions, membership of churches, membership of these fraternal organisations, membership of sports clubs, decline in volunteering. And there has been some studies which show that men who would like to volunteer or previously would volunteer, concerned about things like red tape and that you have to do background checks if your instinct is to volunteer in a youth club. That many people are afraid now, well, are people going to think I'm a paedophile because there's all these moral panics about men and boys and etc. Are people going to think I have sexual interest in young boys or young girls by volunteering in the church or volunteering in the local youth club? So it's a kind of lose-lose situation in a way. The young people don't have volunteers, and the older people who would like to do that feel inhibited from doing that by kind of legislation and changes in the kind of moral climate and moral panic about paedophilia and men, etc. So this decline has had an effect on the social connectiveness of everybody, but especially men. So men used to get a lot of their social connections from these kind of organisations. Because there's been a decline, there's been an increase in loneliness, an increase in social isolation. So there's some papers recently being published which say that we're experiencing an epidemic of loneliness in Canada amongst both men and women, but especially amongst men. And this has all had a negative effect. In terms of the economic cycle, there were some very interesting studies that came out in the last couple of years which show that after the recession in 2009, there was an increase in suicide in most developed countries, which affected men disproportionately more than women. And Canada actually had one of the highest rates in the Western world, higher than the US, higher than the UK, higher than most of Western Europe. Canada had a 10% increase in male suicide in 2009. And this has been related to factors such as work in every country, but particularly in Canada and the US in some ways, is sometimes a kind of man's life. It's where he derives his purpose, his sense of meaning, his sense of belonging. It's where he gets a lot of his social connections. So if he loses his job, he'll lose his insertion into a social network which was providing a lot of support. Whereas work on the social networks of women show that women have perhaps more dense social networks which are less related to the workplace and more related to extended family or friends or people from high school, etc. There are other research studies which show how men tend to be predominantly employed in dirty and dangerous occupations. So if you think about the occupations which are kind of 90% male, almost wholly male, the military, police, mining, fishing, forestry, people who go up north to work in dangerous occupations, they're almost wholly men. And if you just think about the day-to-day work of these occupations, they're often police and military are exposed to trauma, to blood, to accidents, to suicide. Some of these pictures that I put on the wall here are police constables. Lots of work with the police about how there's not enough occupational care for people who have to witness these kind of things. Trades like forestry and fishing and mining are often dependent upon the economic cycle or seasonal cycle. So I was in Newfoundland recently and people there were telling me that, well, people will go and work for a month in Alberta or on oil rigs or fishing, and then they'll get loads of money, they'll come back for a month, and then they won't have any work, they'll have a lot of dead time, and they'll end up kind of drinking or not knowing what to do, and then sometimes they suddenly hear that their contract has not been renewed because fishing stocks have changed or what happened in Alberta with the oil prices, etc. And this can lead people who had a lot of sense, who were anchored into an occupation, just suddenly becoming unemployed. And again, this is a risk factor for suicide. There are some studies on stress in the workplace, longer working hours, 0-hour contracts, less sustainability in some ways, that many of the jobs now will have kind of rolling contracts where employers do not want to give firm assurances that this is going to last longer than a year or 2 years. So for men who pride themselves on being a breadwinner, on having a mortgage, having a car, looking after their family, there's this constant sense of uncertainty. How long is this going to last? There's a risk which is constantly undermining them in some ways. And some studies have shown that this could lead to stress. And then when there is some kind of event, so there's a thing we call the stress vulnerability hypothesis in psychiatry, that you've got this background stress or background vulnerability, and then when some big stress impinges on your life, that puts you very at risk. So if you already feel that you're kind of on shifting sands in some sense, and then you lose your job or you get divorced or your shares crash and you lose your savings, etc., that can be a real nodal point in terms of the suffering of men, and that this can be a factor which can lead to suicide. There was a great paper by a group of researchers here at UBC where they talked about the failed breadwinner model, or they use this phrase, the failed breadwinner, where they say that if you're a man and you're a failed breadwinner, that in other words, you're not bringing in money for yourself, for your family, to enjoy your hobbies, etc., that can be a really distressing time, and that can be a time when suicide rates go higher. Related to unemployment and to losing your job is the third factor that I wanted to discuss today, which I've called life transitions, or we could just call them transitions in general, and the consequences of these transitions. So what are the transitions I'm thinking of? I'll just list them and then I'll go through them one by one in more detail. So divorce, unemployment, going on sick leave, retirement, bereavement. So these are 5 life transitions which put people at a very high risk of suicide. So when we look at the suicide statistics, and we have a method called psychological autopsies, where if somebody kills themselves, we can take 100 people who have killed themselves and then do a kind of autopsy of their social life after the fact by interviewing their spouse or their mother, father, family, friends, etc. And when we do this, we often find that they've recently been through a life transition, through one of these life transitions. Why and how? Let's go into some details. Well, divorce and also the breakup of a common law relationship, which is more common these days, is a life transition which increases risk considerably. Traditionally, this was considered in a kind of conservative framework, I could say, where people said, well, in a marriage you have the support of a wife and you've got your house and the children, and you have this emotional haven from the outside world, and when you get divorced you lose that, and there's definitely some truth in that for men. But more recent theory and evidence is indicating that there's much more to it than that, and the issue that Don said is one that comes up regularly, the issue of the so-called legal system and so-called family courts and so-called family law, where there's lots of a common perception, shall we say, that men are treated very unfairly by these courts, that they're institutionally sexist in some ways, that there's a perception perpetuated by judges and lawyers that men are villains and women are victims, despite the actual realities of each case, and that this is a very alienating experience for many men, that the courts and the legal system is meant to be a impartial, neutral arbiter of cases. In a country such as Canada, we're not in a tin pot dictatorship. There should be due process and fair trial, etc. But this is not the common experience, at least what we hear from men who undergo these experiences in family court or family law. So the divorce, you do lose that emotional support, you lose that, but men are also find them, the perception at least is that they're maltreated by the courts, and then the reality is that Walter Fox, who is a criminal lawyer in Toronto, told me that the increase in people representing themselves in family court is astronomical, and the reason is because the outcome is more or less never in doubt. That the mother is going to get the children, get the house, get the alimony, get this, get that, and the man will just be left, have to move into a bedsit and see his children once or twice a month. And that this is a process of loss and expropriation which can be very damaging to men's mental health. The second transition which I talked about was unemployment and financial strain. So I already kind of touched on that earlier, but again, employment not only gives you, employment gives you so many things. It gives you money, it gives you a way to occupy your time wisely, it gives you contact with other humans and potential friendships, it gives you access to trade unions or to professional associations where you go to conferences and you meet people and you feel like you're contributing to society. When you lose your job, you lose a lot of that. And this again is a time when we see suicide risk increases. And I talked about that, so for the purposes of time, I'll leave it at that. Another factor which is causative in suicide is chronic illness, and especially there's been studies on sick leave, which is when men who have a job are put on sick leave, and this extends over time longer than a few months, that this increases their risk of suicide. And again, I think that's related to the whole unemployment literature, that you're moving from someone who has a role in society, who's a breadwinner, who's contributing, who feels embedded in a network, professional network, and then you've moved from somebody who's housebound, who's stuck at home, who's not doing anything, and who feels at least you're not contributing to society. Chronic illnesses, high risk in people who have been diagnosed with cancer, high risk people diagnosed with depression, which I'll get to a bit later. All chronic illnesses lead to a higher risk of suicide, and again that's kind of that's for men and women. I'm sure you can all understand why that is. You're now dealing with medication, there's symptoms of your illness, you might find it difficult to wake up in the morning to do your daily tasks, etc. As I'll get to later, a lot of these factors are common amongst men and women, but it's more the reaction or the response which is not common. So, I mean, we all know this phrase, which I'm sure many of us don't like, man up, or, boys don't cry, etc. That if you're diagnosed with a chronic illness and you're a man and you're complaining and you want services and you want support, that there's still a bit of an attitude that you're not being a real man. And this is something I'll get to later. Interestingly, retirement is a kind of moderate risk factor for suicide. So it increases risk when somebody retires. And again, there's a commonality between retirement, sick leave, and unemployment, and even divorce. That's why I titled this section Transitions. Commonly, people are moving from a role where they were productive, they contributed, they felt valued, there was a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, and they've moved from that role into one where they're not a cog in a machine anymore, they're not necessarily contributing, where they feel, whatever the reality is, they feel like a burden to society or to the people around them. And the final factor in this section I wanted to talk about was bereavement. So we see that spike that I said earlier in people in their late 70s and early 80s. They're people who have retired, and they're also people who have recently been bereaved. So studies show, you're married for 50 years, your wife dies, your children have moved away, you're stuck on your own, you don't feel loved, you don't feel networked into any meaningful social entanglement, and therefore many people just kill themselves as a consequence. So when I get to the section, as I said at the end, I'm going to talk about solutions. These times of transition, I think, are times where we really need to target support of people. And when I say we, I don't only mean statutory services or health services or social services. I also mean we as humans, individuals in this room, of people we know, our own family, of fathers, grandfathers, uncles, whoever, because these are really vulnerable times. The fourth factor that I wanted to talk about was what I've labelled mental health issues. So, as I said earlier, depression is one of the biggest predictors of suicide in men and in women. One of the problems, or one of the theories, or one of the ideas, I should say, about depression, so if you look at the official rates of depression, women have higher rates of depression than men, up to a factor of 3 or 4 times higher. But men have higher suicide than women, up to a factor of 3 or 4 times higher. So this has been a kind of paradox, conundrum, which nobody's really worked out what this is all about. One of the theories which has some evidence is that this is what's known as measurement error, or conceptual bias. If you look at the list of criteria to be diagnosed with depression, some people have said this is a very kind of feminized list. Do you cry a lot? Do you have trouble sleeping, etc., etc. Whereas for men, there's a concept that we used to use in the 80s and 90s, which is coming back. There's a phrase called masked depression. So it's the idea that depression in men is kind of masked in a way, that they express or feel their depression more as kind of anger or irritability, that they engage in substance use as a kind of to anaesthetize the pain of depression, rather than the traditional list of criteria that we use to diagnose depression. So this is getting more and more evidence behind it as time progresses. And I think this is something, there's a group here at UBC, John Olif's group, who do a lot of research on this, which is something which in the next couple of years I think is going to be brought to the policy agenda and might even result in changes to kind of official criteria and diagnosis and services. This idea that men have a masked depression, that psychologists and psychiatrists are not recognizing it, this means they don't get engaged into formal official mental health services, and then they fall through the cracks, and then sadly they end up like the gentleman on this wall, dead. And I think this is something that we really need to address. Another factor is substance abuse. So again, one of the big predictors of suicide is substance abuse. So whether it's illegal drugs or whether it's legal drugs, one could say alcohol or non-alcohol, that this is a predictor. And again, substance abuse is the question that is then raised: what is a predictor of substance abuse? Predictors of substance abuse, exactly those transitions I just said: unemployment, being diagnosed with chronic illness, bereavement, retirement, which again, what are the underlying, I'm trained as a sociologist, what are the underlying issues under that? Lack of purpose, lack of meaning, lack of being embedded into a network, lack of social connection, etc. So there are common variables underneath all of these illnesses: substance abuse, depression, suicide. That brings me on to my next fact. This is a fact, this is incontrovertible. Women are much more likely to use mental health services than men, official mental health services. So when we talk about psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, psychotherapists, etc., and studies all over the Western world have shown this repeated. And this is even when you control for factors that women have certain rate, like depression is 4 times higher in women than men. Even when we can statistically control for that, and we still see this higher rate in women than men. Interestingly, I'm not going to go down this route, but there's a phrase we use called like informal mental health services or unofficial mental health services, and these are things like the clergy, churches, trade unions, one could say, kind of social fraternal organisations, people who you or I might go to if we had an emotional problem, but who doesn't have a PhD or a MSc or whatever didn't go to a university to study one of these caring sciences or whatever. And some evidence shows men are much more likely to use this, or more equal. So what can one conclude from this? Some people have concluded that it's because of men's stubbornness, or because they're self-defeating, and all these kind of hackneyed platitudes that we hear all the time, which there's some truth in that. I think that's, as I said, that's one piece of the jigsaw. But I think a more intelligent analysis is that mental health services as currently configured are not attuned to men's needs. That the idea that you sit down and you sit still and you talk for 60 minutes about your problems. There was a great study at the University of Minnesota, I think, which asked men why they didn't do this, and they just said they don't see the point. They don't want to talk about this. They're more interested in kind of solving problems. And some of them said, which is supported by evidence, by talking about a problem, you bring it from the kind of subconscious to the conscious, which then kind of makes it worse. A lot of people, it's kind of Western idea that if you talk about things, it's going to make it better, but that's not the case. You know, it's certainly feasible that actually it could make it worse. That it's an old Freudian idea of suppression of feelings, that, you know, if you suppress what you're feeling about a problem, that somehow it's going to reappear in neurosis or whatever. And that there's a legacy which we still have today of that idea. But as I said, services are not attuned to men's needs. And when I talk about solutions, I'm going to talk about some kind of radical, innovative services which have arisen in the last few years, which seem to be better attuned to men's needs, and seem to be, in early evaluations, have shown them to be very successful in engaging men and helping men. Related to this is lack of choice, I guess one could say. In a socialized healthcare system, like we have in Canada and in Europe, choice is a variable that we feel is a value that is very important, that people should have choice. In psychiatry, we say that we have a model called the biopsychosocial model, where we say people should have a choice to take a range of medication. If you probably statistically, there's a number of you in this room who are diagnosed with depression or anxiety. You've got choice to take medication, to get cognitive behavioral therapy, to get individual counselling, to get psychotherapy, to have kind of social work interventions, have a social worker come and visit you and make sure practically you're eating well and you're exercising, etc. And this is all great. In practice, this is great. It doesn't always happen in practice, but when it does, it's great. Many people have said for men there isn't enough choice, that there should be a greater buffet, one could say, which are more attuned to men's needs. And when I talk about solutions, I'm going to get to this, so just hold that thought on the back burner. Statistically, which is related to what Don was saying earlier, it's a great presentation he did there. So if you look at the gender balance of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, psychotherapists, depending on the survey and when it was done and in what location, etc. I'll give a conservative figure here, that only about 20% of clinicians in these kind of caring professions are men, so 80% women. And this is a kind of controversial topic, so I mean, this is great on the one hand. Men and women should be able to choose whatever job they want, and I think this is great compared to decades ago where it was a reverse. On the other hand, we know from research on kind of ethnicity, etc. There's only I have a friend who's a psychiatrist, Aboriginal in Ontario, and she told me there's only 4 Aboriginal psychiatrists in the whole of Canada. So you can do the math yourself. We know from studies in the US that there's very, very few black psychiatrists or social workers. And there's programs in place to try and increase the number, because some studies show that, as I said, choice is important, and what we call ethnic matching is important. That if you're a black person with depression Alabama or wherever, you might prefer to see a black psychiatrist, and that if we believe in choice, that in a way that should be unproblematic. But when only 1 in 5 clinicians are men, that choice is not necessarily available. And it's interesting in the UK, if you are planning to study clinical psychology now, being male is considered a minority, officially considered a minority group. When on your application form, if you're 21 and you're applying to be a clinical psychologist, you fill in an application form, and it says in the box, which usually says if you're a minority, woman, gay, etc. The box now says if you're come from an ethno-racial minority, sexual minority, or if you're a man, please tick this box, and you get put in a kind of separate stream, which is a kind of interesting phenomena, but it shows that this is a mainstream idea. This is not some kind of wacky idea by kind of bitter men who feel that they've been marginalised in the discipline. And a kind of final point, which is a bit more controversial, but I'll put it out there because people are saying this. I don't know if you've ever heard, I mean, a lot of these YouTubers are saying it, that in kind of psychology, mental health research, mental health practice, that men are considered to be defective women. Has anyone heard that? Yeah, maybe in your videos, or someone on YouTube. I mean, this is not a kind of something out there in the psychiatric literature, but it's an interesting hypothesis. The idea is that the whole kind of foundation, or the whole modality, if you think of psychology and psychiatry as a modality of healing, the foundation of this modality of healing is that you talk about things, that you cry, that you're open about your feelings and your emotions, and that this has traditionally been associated with the female sex, and that somehow men are defective in those ways, which has led people to conclude that men are perceived to be defective women in the psychological encounter, and therefore this is a problem. Literally, if you say if you approach Aboriginal mental health by implying that Aboriginal people are defective white people because whatever, they don't play golf or they don't play hockey or whatever, that would raise us laughter. But this doesn't raise laughter in psychiatry or psychology when you say men need to cry more, talk more, or do X, Y, and Z. That there should be, the idea now, at least on paper, is that health services and social services should be attuned to the group rather than getting the group to attune itself to the service that's available. The services shouldn't be rigid. There shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all solution. And when I get to my solutions piece, I'm going to talk about that more. So I'm on my 5th of 6 theme now. The 5th one, which has been put out there quite a lot, and you've probably all heard this one, I don't think this is anything radical, is that concepts of masculinity. And as I said, this is a piece of the jigsaw, and there have been many intelligent discussions of this, and I'm certainly not going to dismiss it. It's the old argument that men are stubborn, men are self-defeating, men kind of struggle in silence. And this has been related especially to kind of New World countries like Australia, Canada, the US, where they're pioneers societies where, you know, the traditional image of a Canadian man is a lumberjack or backwoodsman or trapper, someone who's out there on his own all day doing things, being very practical, is not sitting talking about his feelings or kind of watching Oprah or whatever. And concepts of masculinity, that men should be independent, should be autonomous, should be providers, should have a job, should be contributing. There's some of the stuff which I think which I'll get to later, the idea of pride and humiliation and how that relates to masculinity. So male pride is often based on their status in society, and status in this society is often based on your employment, your education, your interaction with the opposite sex, being married or having a girlfriend or at least having women around you. We have there's a lot of stigma and a lot of disparaging remarks made about, which is not really, I'm not going to go into this lecture, about young men and boys who live with their parents, live in their basement. We've all heard these like laughable, he lives in the basement with his mother and plays video games all day, etc. But somehow that's not being a real man. It's interesting we don't use that kind of phraseology to refer to women who still live at home or who are in similar states of dependency. This explanation has been used so if you read many papers about suicide in men, they'll always talk about lethality. This is the idea that men are much more likely to kill themselves by gun or by hanging than women, whereas women are more likely to take an overdose or self-poisoning, etc. And this has been used as an explanation for the higher rates in men, but it's a very facile argument, I think. It still begs the question, why are men obtaining the guns, obtaining the rope and doing the act compared to women? The method isn't an explanation as far as I'm concerned. So people have said these concepts of masculinity, we have to change men's pride, men's sense of what is humiliating, what is not humiliating. So some literature says that the whole thing about getting divorced, losing your job is based on men feeling humiliated, that they're, in the eyes of others, they feel that they've been diminished or degraded as a man, and therefore they can't handle the shame and the stigma, and therefore they kill themselves. I think that might be partially a factor, but it's certainly not the complete issue. As I said, when we think about injustices in the so-called legal system, when we talk about financial problems, we talk about men being separated from their children, but these are more issues than this kind of intangible concept of humiliation or pride. But there are still issues. We can talk about it in discussion. So there are people out there who argue that the main way to solve the problem of suicide in men, or to diminish it at least, is to get men kind of more in touch with their feelings. This argument that men are defective women, that they should become more talkative and should cry more and should be more feminized in some ways. Emma Watson made a speech at the UN, I don't know if anyone saw that, where she was saying this is one of the big solutions to men's mental health problems. Well, it's an interesting theory, but there's an easy way to kind of assess whether that theory holds water or not. And one way to do this is what we call time trend analysis. So as time has progressed from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 60s onwards, men have actually become more feminized in many ways. They have become more talkative. Men are looking after the children more, changing diapers. Men are, the new man in the domestic relationship does the dishes at home, does his own ironing, and all these radical things that we didn't do in the past. So men have become more talkative, more crying, more in touch, etc. However, suicide rates have been rising. So if you look at suicides in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, suicides have been rising in Canada and in most countries, but in Canada that's a fact. So there's no relationship at the ecological level between men doing these things which people are constantly barraging them to do and suicide rates decreasing. Likewise, you can look at international studies. So it's a very hard thing to quantify, but for example, suicide rates are very high in Finland and in Cuba and in a lot of the Scandinavian countries. And they're the countries where, like I said, it's very hard to quantify, but people have argued, well, that they're the places where men have become more feminized, one could say. So it's an easy argument, but it doesn't make sense if you look at international and time trends. I personally think, and when I look at the facts, that when we talk about concepts of masculinity, there are important things in that discourse which we could learn to help prevent suicide and address suicide. But this often takes a tone which is berating and belittling to men. It's kind of implying that inferior, that they don't know what they want and what they're doing, that they're kind of weak, and that they need to man up, or they need to change. Whereas my argument throughout this presentation is that society needs to change just as much as men, and the structural levels of society. Instead of berating and belittling men, there's a approach which we used in wider psychiatry called a strengths-based approach. In this strengths-based approach, we look at the strengths of a group, whether it's a group of people with schizophrenia or with depression, rather than saying, you don't have this, you have delusions, you have hallucinations, you have X, Y, and Z, and we need to address that. We say to them, well, actually, you're a person who's worked most of your life, you've raised a family, you've got a lot of strengths, we're going to work with you to try and help you overcome that illness, building on those strengths. And I think that would be a much better approach to men's mental health and men's suicide than berating and belittling them constantly about them not being in touch with their feelings or crying, etc. How long do I have left? 7 minutes. Well, I'll briefly go over my last calls and I'll get on to some solutions. The justice system, or as Don said, we should call it the legal system, is a factor, a double standard. Many people seem to see a double standard at play, that if you're a male victim of domestic abuse or domestic sexual violence, that you're treated with kind of ridicule or indifference. As we just heard, there are 300 shelters for women but 0 shelters for men. That's a practical problem, but also it's a message as well to those who suffer from this, that you're not particularly important as a social group in this society. If you look at the media, I did a study in 2015 where I analysed how the media portray men with mental illness and how they portray women with mental illness, and we found that men were treated by the media much more harshly than women. So there was a lot more stigmatising language, even in the case of similar circumstances. So there was a case, a woman called Elaine Campion, who killed her 2 children in Ontario, and there was a man called Guy Turcotte in Quebec who killed his 2 children. And if you compare and contrast the media articles, the articles about the woman who killed her children were, I'll say, much more humane in a way. They tried to understand why she did it. They looked at her childhood. They looked at her social circumstances. They looked at gaps in service provision, where maybe she could have been served better, which would have prevented this happening. So to me, that's very good journalism, going under the surface, looking at causes, etc. But when we looked at the men who were Guy Turcotte and other men in similar situation, the journalist's approach was more or less lock him up and throw away the key. How can anyone do this? Evil, terrible person, etc. So these are extreme cases I'm using, but even at a much more mundane level of talking about men with mental illness, women with mental illness, we found the media were much more sympathetic to women than men and took a much more punitive approach. And this creates what we sometimes call a kind of moral panic about men. This was manifested, I think, in Justin Trudeau's decision about the Syrian refugees, where he said that male Syrian refugees who are single should not be allowed to come to Canada, only those who are married or young boys. Everything I just said, a kind of double standard in the legal system, the media, Syrian refugees. Some people have said that this is a manifestation of what's known as the demonization of men, which is the kind of last theme here I'm talking about, that men are considered in a wider discourse as kind of barbarians, or not quite barbarians, but they would be barbarians if it wasn't for laws and for groups, protest, keeping society aware that these barbarians are on the edge of chaos and pillage, etc. And some people have argued this is especially the case on campuses, where organisations hosted by, I'm not sure if SFUAMB has ever had any protests.
Nope, not yet.
Okay, great. But some of our sister organisations at the University of Toronto, for example, have been protested by people on campus that somehow it's sexist to talk about issues affecting men and boys. And as I said, that could all lead to, this leads to this theory that there's a kind of demonization of men in society at the moment. So I'm on my final piece of paper here, which is solutions, how long do I have now?
Yeah, fine.
But how much do I have?
I'm not
A few minutes.
I'm not just
Okay. You're very nice. This West Coast relaxed attitude. It's not like this in Ontario. So what are the solutions? So we often in social science we talk about kind of micro solutions, meso solutions and macro solutions. So macro refers to change at society, meso to kind of changes of services, and micro changes in the individual. I think there are various areas which need to be reformed. I think reform of the legal system, what Don was saying earlier, service provision for people, for example, male victims of domestic violence, domestic abuse, specific support for life transitions. So there's an overwhelming weight of literature that these transitions are very difficult for men. Unemployment, bereavement, retirement, divorce, that there should be some kind of specific programs available for them, just as the same way we have specific programs for women who are pregnant and women who have just given birth, which is quite right, that they're important life transitions, but we don't have similar programs for men. There should be much more choice in mental health services. So there's this great new intervention which started in Australia, but it has become pioneered in BC in some ways, which are called men's sheds. So I don't know if anyone knows much about these, but they're places which have been developed where men can go to do kind of woodworking, repair bikes, watch hockey on TV, do things, very practical things, rather than sitting and talking about their feelings. And these are aimed at men who are lonely, who are isolated, who have a diagnosis of depression or anxiety perhaps, but that's not a criteria, it doesn't have to be a definitive mental illness. But some evaluation shows that these are very popular, they'll engage men, and they're very helpful for men's mental health because they're very practical oriented. And I've got a research assistant working for me in Montreal at the moment, and she did I asked her just to look at kind of men's services, women's services, and she sent me an email which said, it's kind of interesting, every major city in Canada has a women's hospital, but things like men's sheds, which are very small economically, they're small fry to fund. They're very difficult to get started on the ground. In terms of wider social policies, some people have argued there should be more equal representation of men and women in health and education. So I think 80-90% of primary school teachers are women, and even in high school it's still a majority women. So for young boys it's hard to find role models and to see men in those situations helping them. Reform of family law. So this is another common factor which comes up, that there's been this drive for shared parenting in Canada, which the previous Harper government and even Jean Chrétien at some point supported this, but because of parliamentary time, or who knows the real reasons, that was the excuse they gave. They didn't push the bill forward. This is the idea that parenting time is equally spent between the father and the mother, and that this is considered good for the child as well as good for the parents. And finally, I guess I would like to say that Canada is one of the few countries in the Western world that doesn't have a national anti-suicide strategy. And there's the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, which is an NGO, a kind of non-profit, which has developed its own strategy, but that's a great strategy, but that's not technically a national strategy because it's not endorsed by the government. It hasn't come to its conclusions through involvement of various stakeholders and in a kind of formal process. So we have a national mental health strategy which is produced by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, which came out in 2012. And we were the last country of the G8 to have a national strategy. And people always say, well, that's because Canada is a federal country and the provinces, etc. But Australia is a federal country, US is a federal country, the UK is a federal country. They all have national strategies. So to me, that's a lame excuse. And I really think we should have a national strategy to prevent suicide in everybody. But like we always do in these strategies, there should be targeted chapters at groups who suffer higher inequalities. And the two groups in terms of suicide are men and Aboriginal people. So I really think we should have we should have a discussion, a national suicide strategy, discussion that gets to that strategy, which involves stakeholders like many of you in this room. And to me, that's something that I'm working to hope to change. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the discussion.